there's
out
still
of
a
the
few
office.
people coming in, so
No?
Mark Bonham is here, so.
Okay. Oh, that's nice. I have to read the.
And you got the land.
Yeah.
Briefly.
Oh, no. Oh, there he is.
Yeah.
Okay. The room is bringing itself to a suitable hush, so I will begin. Before I say anything else, I want to give an acknowledgement of traditional land. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'm Charlie Kyle. I'm the... You can't hear me. Can you hear me now? I'm looking at the one person who said he couldn't hear me. He's still not, he's not willing to give me. I think that's about as loud as most people would want me to be. So I'm going to assume that's going to work for the majority. So I'm Charlie Kyle. I'm the principal of Innis College. And it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. And when one reads any biography of Peter Russell, one is immediately taken aback with the breadth of the accomplishments and feels somewhat humbled to even be in the position of introducing such a person. So one could, for example, gesture to the Order of Canada. I don't know how many people in the room have an Order of Canada, but I don't imagine it's a lot, or I'm going to be very impressed with this room. But beyond that, and certainly apropos of the topic, which I'll get to in a moment, Peter has also been a member of the Federal Task Force on Comprehensive Land Claims, chair of the Research Advisory Committee on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and director of research for the Macdonald Commission on the RCMP. And when he's not doing that kind of work, putting on his political science hat, he's a winner of the American Political Science Association's Mildred A. Schwartz Award, and also there's so many things here. I'm trying to pick out the ones, and also president of the Canadian Political Science Association. So, obviously, professor emeritus within the political science department at University of Toronto, but why he's especially important to us at Innis College, and I hope many of you in the room know this, he is a past principal of Innis College. And I will say, as a current principal of Innis College, that I am again somewhat awestruck that someone with that voluminous record of achievements once sat where I'm now sitting. What you should also know, so Peter was principal from 1971 to 1976. And he was the principal responsible for getting the building we're sitting in built. So he will forever be known and loved for that accomplishment. And also somewhat near and dear to me as a past director of cinema studies, he was a key player in getting cinema studies established as a discipline at the University of Toronto. So, needless to say, a man of many accomplishments. And the particular accomplishment we are acknowledging this evening with Peter's presence is his most recent book. Now, some of the other books that preceded this book include Two Cheers for Minority Government, The Evolution of Canadian Parliamentary Democracy, Constitutional Odyssey, Canadians Become a Sovereign People, and Recognizing Aboriginal Title, The Mabo Case and Indigenous Resistance to English Settler Colonialism. And now that brings us to the current moment. Now, most people, having done everything you've already heard, would say, I'm ready for a break. Not Peter. Peter has now written his most recent book, Canada's Odyssey, a country based on incomplete conquests. And we are extremely pleased to welcome him and honored to have him share some of that book with us now. And it will be followed by a Q&A so that you can ask questions of this book's author. So without further ado, Peter Russell.
Thank you, Charlie, for that very generous introduction. And thank you all here tonight for turning up and being interested in what I have written and what I have to say. Looking at this hall, I remember when we said we'll have a town hall, the students and the staff of the college, and then Jack Diamond designed it, and didn't quite look like this. It looked okay, but now it looks terrific. And I never dreamed I'd be standing in this terrific hall, and above all things, at my age, introducing and talking about a new book. So it's great to be here, and I thought I'm not going to talk very long, but I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I came to write Canada's Odyssey. It really comes from a problem that arose with my first Odyssey book. In 1990, with University of Toronto Press, which has been a wonderful publisher for me, we published Constitutional Odyssey. Right, stop. It's not Canada's Odyssey. Okay? This is Canada's Odyssey. Here's Constitutional Odyssey, 1990. Got it? It has a subtitle. Oh, and that's where you make your point of your book. Subtitle of Constitutional Odyssey is Can Canadians Become a Sovereign People? Pretty big question. Can Canadians become a singular, one sovereign people? And when the book came out, that subtitle caused a lot of wrinkled brows in the kind of people who mostly make up our audience tonight, because I'm assuming that most of you are not Aboriginal people. Maybe there are a few in the audience, and most of you are not French Canadians. You're English-speaking Canadians. You may not be English Canadian. You may be Welsh. My people are Welsh. You may be from the Philippines. You may be from the United States. It could be anywhere. But most of the people I talked to afterwards from English-speaking Canada said, what the hell are you talking about? Can Canada become a sovereign people? That's what we are. No French-Canadian friend and no Aboriginal friend had any wrinkled brow. They knew exactly what I was talking about. They thought it was a terrific subtitle. Terrific. Most of them, strong Canadians, I repeat that, most French Canadians and most Aboriginal peoples are strong Canadians, but they also have an allegiance to a nation that's within Canada, and for many, that's their first priority. That's their first sense of identity. That's their first sense of identity. They also identify as being Canadian, but their first identity is with French Canada, or with the Mi'kmaq, or the Plains Cree, or the Haida, and so on, or the Métis Nation. And so as the wrinkled brows continue, and I got some very stern lectures and reviews that didn't like it at all and said, damn it, doesn't he know we're a sovereign country? I began to think about the difficulty of English-speaking Canada, accepting where I seem to be going in my thinking about Canada. I did a fair bit of traveling to other countries, including Europe, and as I traveled and began to explain what was happening in Canada, this was through the 90s, when we were watching the Charlottetown referendum rejected, where we were watching Quebec biting our fingernails reject a referendum in 1995. It was becoming clear both that the people of Canada are not a single sovereign people who can say yes to anything. They could certainly say no. The Charlottetown referendum showed that. And the same thing could be said for Quebec. It wasn't a sovereign French people. The Quebec was showing that it was also if it's a nation or a province, it has nations within. And so I began to articulate in my own mind, why are we so different? And I came up with this concept of incomplete conquests. The fact that the Aboriginal peoples and French Canada hung in there, even though the big pillar, the English-speaking pillar, which by 1800 begins to dominate in both power, numbers, and every other way, the country, wants to get rid of them. Not by violence. Oh, no, 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 no. We're nice English-speaking Canadians. Do it by administration and constitutional means. Some ones were not so nice, and I point out the so-called peaceable kingdom has wreaked dreadful physical harm on both French Canada at times and certainly the Aboriginal people. But I began to think that what really makes Canada distinct among the countries of the world. Let me pause and say, you notice I said countries. I didn't say nations. I didn't say state. Those are fighting words in Canadian politics. I said country, which is not a fighting word. It's a word that we're all agreed upon, all three foundational pillars. And what really makes us distinct in the whole world is that this big, strong, ambitious, one nation, English-speaking Canada didn't do it, didn't get the job done, and what's even more miraculous, eventually the leaders of English-speaking Canada come to accept the diversity of the country, the presence of the French, Canadian within Canada as a nation, and the Aboriginal peoples as nations. I think and I think that's the clue to what makes Canada distinct in the whole world. And it's an ambitious thing to try to figure out for your own people what's special about them, and to explain that to the world. And it's an appropriate, though, ambition in this hall, because Harold Innes had a similar ambition. His thesis was that it was more economic, that the flow of staples like furs and the cod, their flow into international trade is what really shapes and has shaped Canada. And it certainly is those Canada's interest in selling products that it's strong in is still a dominating factor. Just consider your newspapers this morning or your TV broadcast. What kind of dominated? Trade talks, Innes stuff. I mean, we're on the edge of a big empire with a mad guy in charge. And Innes was all onto that, the dangers of being a marginal country, trying to be nice. And what's the other big thing in our news? Several stories about Aboriginal people. So there's Harold and there's Peter. Something we're saying about the country must be relevant. Well, the basic argument of my book is, just to put it in the form of, I'm told this is an elevator talk. The big publisher, U of T Press, never did this to me, but the publisher says, well, Russell, let's go on. I'm going to the 11th floor. When I get off, whatever you told me, that's all I'm going to hear about your book. And here it goes. So push, I'm on the elevator. It's the interaction of the three foundational pillars, not three nations. I'm not a three nations guy. I'm a three pillars guy. And they're not founding pillars, they're foundational. Aboriginal people didn't found Canada. They're foundational pillars. Their interaction, their changing relations, which are driven by changes in each of those pillars. As you go through my book, you'll see how French Canada, Aboriginal Canada, and English-speaking Canada, got it? English-speaking Canada, how they change in their aspirations and in their conditions. It's usually both. The circumstances in which they find themselves change. And that's the dynamic that really drives our history. And the plot line in this story, the Odyssey, is that the big pillar, English-speaking Canada, which by the early 1800s is dominating, it has this idea of let's be one nation, and we can't do that with French in our midst. So we got to convert them into being English. That's the big plan of the 1840s. Lord Durham put them, all French Canada, in one big Canadian province in which the English-speaking people will be the dominant people. And as Lord Durham and others said, and it'll be damn good for them too, because the English-speaking people are smarter and more efficient. French Canadians are very nice, but they'll be better off. They'll be way better off if they just disappear. And that was the aim. The Aboriginal people, it was rather different. We certainly needed and wanted them. As I tell, and you'll see chapter 5 of the book, 3 wars and 3 betrayals. They really were crucial, and by they I mean there are about 20 to 24 nations south of the Great Lakes and right up to Lake Superior, over to the Mississippi, what we called in those days the Northwest. They kept Canada from falling into American hands. They really were crucial in the defense of Canada. That isn't why they did it. They did it because Britain used them as proxies, promising, as you'll read, we'll support you to have your own buffer state. west of the Alleghenies to stop American expansion. And 3 times Britain betrayed His Majesty's Indian allies. And then after all that was over in 1812 and no longer needed, the real dreadful thing, and it is the most dreadful thing that ever happened to Aboriginal people, way worse, if you can imagine, residential schools, which were bad. The settlers poured in from Europe, mostly from Britain, some from European countries. And the settlers were descendants of Europeans who had survived the Great Plague in the 1400s. And they had immune systems they didn't even know about. And they were carrying germs they didn't know about. And the result was, at the most conservative estimate, for the Aboriginal people in what we now call Southern Ontario, which was then Upper Canada, a death rate over 25 years of 50%. Others say it was decimated. It's very hard. There's no census data to work with. But we know how miserable it is when half the people in your family and your community are dying and you don't know why. That's the pits, folks. And you're in a very, very weak position when that's happening. You're demoralized. You're bewildered. You're being proud nations. You kept the Americans out, but now you're not needed, and you're sick, and many of you are dying. It can't get much worse than that. And so a confederation, you're pushovers to be just a subject matter of legislation for the new federal parliament. And then they get the full weight of a new, strong Dominion government. And I say a lot about its strength. John A. Macdonald was a terrific administrator. So was Mackenzie, for that matter. And they really plowed in to the Indian peoples. As you all, I'm going to rehearse all the details here. You can read my book. But we were now fueled by, the English-speaking people, and to some extent the French-speaking Canadians, we were fueled by really what was for most Europeans a relatively new ideology. It was the ideology that the European civilization is not just culturally pretty good, but is racially, because of blood and biology, better than any others, including those savage native people. So the best damn thing we could do for them is to make them as much as we could possibly like us, because we're the tops, and they're down near the bottom. And boy, did we go at it. And my longest chapter in the book is on the details of that effort, and it's left many scars. And so eventually we start changing our ways, and I'll say a bit about that. The Aboriginal people and French Canada, 2 things, are putting them down, as you just give it 5 seconds thought, was extraordinarily powerful in stimulating their own sense of nationhood, of their own nations. If you really want to produce nationalism, don't tell people they stink and they're no good and you're going to try to get rid of them. Even if they were mildly proud of their people or their nation, they'll be a hell of a lot more proud than after they've taken that on the chin. But nonetheless, we eventually come to accept the nations within. And I'm just going, I know I'm running short of time, Charlie. I want to read you my conclusion and then just say one more thing about it and how we get to this conclusion. I give you my, oops, I got the wrong book. constitutional Odyssey. Now, I end on a very optimistic note about this Odyssey. It comes to a kind of semi-happy ending. Canadians, I recognize, Canadians are not supposed to think of themselves in grandiose ways. Oh no, that's not us. But I do suggest, in closing the book, that what we have learned about living well together could be of value to all of humankind. Multinational, multicultural Canada might offer more useful guidance for what lies ahead for the peoples of this planet than the tidy model of the single nation state, single nation sovereign state. As an example of how diverse peoples can live together in freedom and peace, this loose, never settled alliance of peoples called Canada, loose, never settled. If you read the review in the Literary Review of Canada, never settled. It's not settled. You can't fix it. Don't try to fix it. Try to live with it and soothe along. This loose, never settled alliance of peoples called Canada could replace empire and nation state as the most attractive model in the 21st century. So towards the end of the book, I talk about the celebration of diversity that we have been going through in the last 5 or 6 years. At all levels of leadership in the country, intellectual, artistic, and certainly political. And I say that that diversity is and seeing it as crucial to the character of the country. It's the seventh part of the civic culture we've been building in Canada. I'll repeat that. Throughout the book, I'm very conscious that if we only had our differences and nothing in common, nothing that we shared, hell, we'd have broken up a long, long time ago. So there must be some glue. And the glue is a civic culture. I identify 7 components. The sense that diversity is a terrific thing is the newest, the most recent, very recent, at least for English-speaking Canada. What are the other 6? Well, my God, Russell, it's 7 o'clock and you're going to take us through 6 points. I can do 2 or 3. You're going to hammer us with 6? Yeah, I am, but I'm going to be short about it, so don't worry. They're easy to remember. 3 are before Confederation. 3 of our civic culture have really emerged before Confederation. 1 really crystallizes, and we nail it down at Confederation, and 3 afterwards. So that's 3, 1, and 3. Easy. The 3 that we really have nailed down pretty well by 1867 are these. First, parliamentary government, mainly a British import, but by God, the first model was terrible, no power in the elected house, so it wasn't a model parliamentary system until power went to those who have the confidence of the elected assembly. But the parliamentary government as a model in which those who head the government are also the leaders in the legislature. Those who head the executive also are the leaders in the legislative. That's just fundamental. You can see it right now. It means, among other things, that you have to have cabinet government. You can't have a prime minister with just his cronies who he drags in from off the streets. You have to have cabinet government. Means you've got to surround yourself with parliamentarians who have their own political base. And even if you have a sort of authoritarian streak, parliamentary government means you have to observe collegial kind of decision making, which has served us awfully well. The second is constitutionalism. That's huge. It's the idea that whoever rules, even if it's a popular government or a monarch, whoever it is subject to basic limits, basic processes that those who govern must observe, or they would be illegitimate. No one has absolute power, including the leader of a popular government, or in the British case, the king. They had become a constitutional monarchy about 100 years before they took over here, as had the Aboriginal people for a long time, being constitutional peoples with quite elaborate constitutional arrangements. For French Canada, it was a kind of new thing. They'd been under absolutism, but did they ever take to constitutional government? And the limits on those who rule, the constitutional limits, up to Confederation for quite a long time after, are basically unwritten conventions. They're not all written down, and they're enforced politically, but then we get into Bills of Rights and Charter rights, and we keep adding to the restraints on those who govern. That's constitutionalism, very basic to our culture. And the third, and you might challenge me on this, is monarchy. Monarchy was an extraordinary source of unity at the beginning for French and British and Aboriginal people sharing the same crown. It's remained a very, very important source of unity for Aboriginal people in the rest of Canada. Maybe less so for French Canada, but we should talk about that. I think it's here to stay. The Republican movement, last time I looked, might have a dozen members, but doesn't seem to me to be coming around the corner. And our vice sovereign representatives in Canada have really been doing so well, including our new Governor General. I think monarchy is here to stay. A confederation added one component, and that was not federalism. The fathers of Confederation, you should know, were very divided about federalism. One of the strongest group were from here, led by John A. Macdonald, who hated federalism and hoped he could get rid of it in a couple of years after we formed the country, and did all he could to make the Constitution as centralized with central power very, very dominant. What became part of our civic culture at Confederation was social democracy. What did he say? Social democracy. What the hell? He's socialist? That's my shorthand for an agreement that government is good and government must do big things. Our Constitution gave each level of government a big shopping list of things to do, things to build, things to manage. We weren't a country that was going to say, even though it would be a capitalist country, as long as you leave everything to the market, we'll all live happily ever after. That was never the assumption on left or right in Canadian politics. Never has been, never will be. We're a country who thinks government can do lousy stuff, but it can also do, and we want it to do, big stuff and good stuff. In that sense, that was nailed down at Confederation. Immediately after Confederation, here comes federalism. It came just like that, through politics and law. Extraordinarily strong premiers in Ontario and Quebec, up against a really strong prime minister in Ottawa, and a court giving much more power to the provinces than John A. Macdonald fancied. But what that gave us was this statement I've made in many conferences around the world. It meant that we are the most federal country in the world. What I mean by that, we don't have centralized or decentralized power. We have two strong levels of government. Ambitious politicians at each level, usually at one level, they're from a different political persuasion than the other, and they compete for popularity and jurisdiction and power. And there's no other country in which that kind of competitive federalism, a federal ethic, that everything you look at you must consider is it federal or provincial, or maybe they both should be doing it. We became really, really federal. The next change, and the one before diversity, sort of leads to it, is just huge. It may be the biggest one for most of the young people in this room. And that's when we gradually, after World War II, our leaders, our writers, our intellectuals, our lawyers, our professors embraced universal human rights. We gave up the idea that there are superior races or peoples. We led in the formation of the UN and writing the UN, the Charter of Rights, in which all peoples have the right to self-determination. Peoples, not countries, not nations, all peoples have the right to self. That was just a fundamental term. It took a while, and it has taken a while for that belief in universal human rights to trickle down, and there's often we fall short of its ideals, but it's there as part of our civic culture. And finally, we have that celebration of diversity. Now, when I say those are parts of civic culture, they're not values. I value chocolate ice cream more than strawberry ice cream. Value talk is cheap talk, shallow talk. These are fundamental principles and practices of government. They're thick and strong and hard, and they're there, and they're us. And they're the glue that holds us together. So I'll just conclude when I comment at the end of my book on the civic culture, I say this, and this I'm going to conclude here. All of the ingredients of the civic culture that I have identified have to do with constitutional developments, institutions, and government. What might be more fundamental in forming a bond of unity among French, Aboriginal, and English-speaking Canadians is the physical beauty and grandeur of the northern country we share and we treasure. That is in our songs and in our souls, and more than anything else makes us a people. Thank you. Okay.
So just wait for a second for this to, there we go. We're just going to move the podium and then also get set up for Q&A. Okay, we're not going to move the podium. So I'm going to sit very close to Peter. Get chummy. Give you water in case you want it. So you may not see my head, but worse things have happened, believe me. So I'm going to begin by asking a couple of questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience, and so prepare yourselves. This is actually not so much because I want to hog questioning time. It's just to give you time so that when you ask your question, it's a good question. Okay. You've seen the quality of the speaker. Your questions have to rise to that level. Sorry. So perhaps it's because I just came from a talk across campus on methodology given by an historian. I wanted to ask you how you position yourself as a political science professor writing about, in a sense, the history of a country's development. In other words, how do you distinguish your work from those who would say they're Canadian historians? How do you distinguish your approach to those?
Well, I belong to, I guess, a school of political science that sometimes referred to as having a theory of path dependency. The idea is that you can't understand a country's politics here and now unless you understand crucial events and developments that occurred in the past. You don't have to know the whole history. But if you don't know any of the history, you're not going to know how the country got to where it is today and where it might go from here. So it's a selective kind of history. It's very broad brush. Although in my chapters, I think if some of you have read the book, I think you'll find, I hope this won't put you off, they're crammed with some details. I mean, when I deal with the treaties, I tell you what's in those treaties. They're not just a word. You know, when you get to Lord Durham, you really meet Radical Jack, an English lord, and find out how he spent his 5 months in what is now Canada, and how he arrived at a good idea, responsible government, and a dreadful idea of one nation. But anyway, there's lots of detail, but it all has to hinge on this sort of thesis that the country's path that it's on is created by the relations between these three foundational pillars. It's how they interact that drives us into new stages, either new crises or new achievements.
And do you find that when people respond to your book, either publicly through reviews or in conversation with you, that there is a different kind of response coming from historians of Canada versus political scientists of Canada?
Well, not really, because this is sort of a mean thing to say. The current generation of Canadian historians, professional historians, and that's so important. That means working in universities, trying to get tenure and get advanced to full professor, to take off 7 or 8 or 10 years to write books like Harold Innes and Peter Russell did. They don't do it. There are historians like Rostin Saul, who does it beautifully, and he's not a licensed historian. I think it's very hard for this generation of historians to take the big picture. I think there's quite a few political scientists, including Charles Taylor, Gagnon in Quebec, and others who do take the big picture, who have somehow, but they're a generation in their 60s, 70s, and 80s.
So I won't report that response back to the history department, of which I'm a member,
you see,
by the way.
Margaret McMillan couldn't find a position in that part, and she's a big picture historian. There's a big picture historian. And
yeah, I'll just tell all the little picture historians back in my department that they need to get their acts together. All right, so my other question is quite apart from that one, and like you say, you present something of a rosy or optimistic picture at the end of the book, but I'm wondering, because you often are a commentator in the media on, let's say, current government practice and policy, what do you, if you were to give the government advice, as you have in the past, in terms of ongoing, and it seems, questions of Indigenous rights and claims that have not yet been adequately addressed. And this government came into power, for example, with a promise that it was going to do things differently. And certainly if one listens to Indigenous leaders, the posture is, you're not doing any better than previous governments have. What advice would you give this government as to how to make amends or make movement toward, let's say, more substantive reparation?
I'd say live up to your commitments you've made to the 94 calls for action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. One of those calls for action means also living up to your obligations under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. We don't need a new recipe book for where we have to go. we need to push the government along that line. And we are pushing. But part of the slowness, and it's dreadfully slow, is not just of the Aboriginal people, the federal government and provinces haven't put up the money that is required, and I say quite a bit about that in the last chapter of my book, but Aboriginal peoples they're particularly not the Inuit, they're in good shape. They have 4 strong communities. The Métis Nation is doing pretty well. But the Amerindian nations, about 56 of them, we broke them up. My ancestors, our government in the 1870s shattered them, and they did it deliberately to divide and conquer. And until they can start putting together larger organizations than the small so-called First Nations that were set up under the Indian Act, it's hard to make progress. They've just done this in Manitoba on education with some terrific leadership, and I'm proud to say that U of T, both the Rotman School and political science, helped with that, help that leadership. Cause a lot of it was just plain leadership. Aboriginal people, like almost all people in politics, everything's local. And when a grand chief comes along with a grand idea of how 56 First Nations in Manitoba should pool their strength in order to take over full responsibility for the education of their people, that's a huge achievement and brilliant leadership. Inspired, and some help from outside. I don't know how helpful we are. We tried to be helpful. But that is going on all over. The Mi'kmaq have done very well, much better than most in Nova Scotia. So it takes 2 to tango. You've got to have an Aboriginal organization that's coherent and united, and with enough people in it to avoid corruption and to have skills, skilled people, to deliver whatever it is, social services, health, education. You can't just say, get rid of the Indian Act and go and run your own lives. Yeah, good luck. Good luck, that won't work. So it takes, both sides have a lot to do. But I just want to say, I would also tell the federal government, you have not taken, you haven't, in a respectful way, responded to the government of Quebec's tremendous effort in this sesquicentennial year to reach out to all Canadians with a wonderful booklet called How Quebecers Want to Be Canadians. It was poo-pooed by our media writers as, oh, they want to go back to the constitutional table, and we hate that. Go away. Tomorrow, Jean-Marc Fournier, Minister of Quebec for Canadian Relations, will be speaking at the U of T Law School at 12:30. It'll be the 4th time I've seen him. You should all get out to hear him. And Quebec government wants to interact with Canadian citizens outside of Quebec, with people like you. They're looking for invitations, Charlie. They would accept an invitation anytime to this hall, all across the country. And we're being badly led on that front by the federal government and by provincial governments. This is a terrific government in Quebec in terms of Canadian unity. It has a very different sense of what Quebec is all about, recognizing Aboriginal people and the constitutional position of the English minority. It's not just a French nation. It's a very complicated nation. So I just want to put a plug in. We're giving a cold shoulder to French Canada in our preoccupation with Aboriginal issues, and we shouldn't do that.
I got 2 answers for my 1 question. Okay, so now if we have a microphone, we have a question down near the front.
My question is a very practical one. How can the comprehensive land claim policy needs to be modified, or can it, as it is now, respond to the Truth and Reconciliation calls for action?
What was the,
How can the comprehensive land claim policy
yes.
be, or is it a good
Well,
step towards?
They have to change the policy. One of the, of course, if they won't change the policy, then they've said they've accepted the 94 calls. And one of them, for instance, is to reverse the onus of proof in land claim cases. That's one of the calls. What that means, if an Aboriginal nation says, this is our historic land, and we want to look after it and run what happens on it, govern it, and you say, or government says, provincial or federal, no it isn't, then the challenge is on those who say that is not your historic land. That's the opposite of what it is now. The way things go now, you have to start, the Aboriginal people have to prove to our satisfaction that they've been on these lands, you know, for hundreds of years. Reversing the onus of proof was very important. The Minister of Justice made a speech not so long ago in which she said she was on the way to doing that. I wrote a letter to the Globe and Mail that shows you how my sun is eclipsed, saying, wow, that's going to help on call number 53. They didn't publish it. That is one, and I think they didn't publish it because it's good news for the government. And they wanted me to, you know, spank the government. Instead, I gave it a little pip. So there is progress. A week ago Friday, page 4 of the Globe and Mail, the 94th call. We're going to do it, changing the oath of citizenship to recognize you have to be loyal not just to the laws of Canada, but to the treaties. The Deputy Minister in charge of the government's Reconciliation Secretariat, a lot of words there, the Government of Canada has a Reconciliation Secretariat, which has gone over to Carolyn Bennett's part. The guy who runs that tells me that they made progress on 2/3 of the calls that are addressed to the federal government. I have shot back, give me the details so I can share them with other Canadians. I haven't got an answer yet, but I'll get it. I'll get it. We are making a little bit of progress. It's damn slow. But I don't think we need another recipe book. I really don't. If you have the UN Declaration and the 94 calls to come along and say, oh, no, a whole new approach. We did that. We had the Royal Commission in 1991 to 95. Let's not go back and try to redesign a whole new set of solutions. Let's work on the ones we got, but keep the government accountable for how it's doing. And remember, a lot of the calls, if you look at them, are addressed to the private sector, to the churches, to municipalities. They're not just things that the government has to do, they're things that all of us have to do. Read the calls, they're online, 7 pages.
Okay,
Yes.
there's a question right there.
I'm surprised with you talked about your 7 points. I'm surprised you missed one, the 8th, which I think is a respect for a strong, independent judiciary in this country.
Respect?
Respect for a strong and independent judiciary in this country.
Well, thank you for that. The first book talk I gave this fall was to a group of lawyers and judges at Waterloo, and I did it all on the judges. Well, constitutionalism has come to depend very much on an independent and impartial judiciary. But I'm afraid to say, and one of my main areas of scholarship is being the politics of the Canadian judiciary, we were very slow in getting government, even at the top, to respect judicial independence, particularly where it really counts at the bottom level in criminal courts, so on. We had police courts, we had we didn't have impartial criminal justice until well into the 20th century. It is fundamental to being a constitutional country. You've got to have free, independent, and impartial judges and applying those parts of our constitutional system that are laws and legal. But we got there later. So I make it it's part of making constitutionalism effective. We were slow getting there. And I won't bore you, but I spent a lot of time trying to get the politics out of judicial appointments. It's one of the things I really worked at. And a heavily partisan political judiciary is not independent. And that battle kind of right up through the 20th century. We're getting there. We've now changed the way we're selecting people for the Supreme Court. But there's still a lot to be done. So I can't say that we're really there with an independent and impartial judiciary. I think we're getting close, and we sure need it for constitutionalism.
Oh, this side is really, they've had it. The first one you come to there, Lynch? Yep.
Thank you very much, Professor Russell, for a very interesting talk. I mean, it certainly made me want to buy your book. Just the front cover raises for me a very intriguing hypothetical. And my question is, what might a complete conquest have looked like? I'm looking
What
at
might a critique?
a completed conquest look like. I mean, I'm thinking of the U.S. I mean, they drove out the Loyalists, they drove out the Spanish, they drove out the French, they drove out the Russians, and they subdued the Indians. Is that what a completed conquest would look like? Would have looked like?
I suppose. I thought you were going to raise another question with the cover. I thought you were from Newfoundland. Look at the cover.
I only wish.
I'm going to get nailed there, aren't I? I'll be going there. Yes, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, with the French community that, part of the French community that went south into New England and then Louisiana, I think that's their fate. Durham really admired what was happening to the French in the United States. They were just blending in, becoming better entrepreneurs, giving up that French language stuff. He had no problem with them being Catholics. That's okay. For Aboriginal people, it's a bit of a different story in the United States. There's 10 times as many Aboriginal people in the U.S. than here, but still that's a smaller percentage of the population. And they're a force, but not as strong as they are in Canada. And I've written about this. I think the United States people, I put it this way, exhausted their moral energy on the civil rights movement in the 60s, on ending or trying to end discrimination against Afro-Americans. And that was huge. And the treatment of Aboriginal people got sort of pressed down. The Aboriginal people, though, in the United States have been extraordinarily resourceful in pressing their claims in courts for violations of treaties, for organizing really fully self-governing nations, mostly in western part of the United States. If you go out to Navajo and see what those people, how they run themselves, they've even got a college for Aboriginal judges. And the strongest Aboriginal force now that does occasionally make the headlines in the United States is in Hawaii, the King movement, and trying to revive the historic monarchical culture. But it's all very subsumed. It's not big news in the United States, is it? You can read an American paper for weeks, including the New York Times, and not find the word indigenous there. And so you might come to the wrong conclusion that they don't count. So I guess I'm suggesting that the indigenous people might have, in the United States, if we completed the conquest, I suppose they might be at least as well off as they are in the United States today.
Do you think that the 7 components that you've listed of a strong civil government,
not government, civil culture.
Civil culture.
Oh yeah, crucial.
Okay, is enough to protect Canada from the rise of populism that we're seeing south of the border and also across the Atlantic?
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I mentioned parliamentary government with its collegial way of governing with cabinet. That in itself is a huge protection. You could have a cabinet minister or a prime minister who, caters to some of the worst instincts among the people. But even so, even if it's the prime minister doing that, he or she has a cabinet to contend with and a parliament that had no choice. He's got to have its confidence every day. And if he loses it, Mr. Trump is clearly losing the confidence of Congress, and he carries on, you don't carry on in Canada. So I think parliamentary government is hugely important. I hope our embracing universal human rights, as we have done, makes us conscious of our role in the whole world. We play a big role around the world, or try to, in protecting and advancing human rights, not just in Canada. I don't see that as deeply entrenched in the U.S., which is much more insular in its thinking. So populists who want to make America great, America first, wouldn't do well. We did have a horrible Canada First movement. You'll meet it in my book. It was so strong around the time of Louis Riel's success in Red River in negotiating Manitoba's entry into Canada, but unfortunately having a firing squad kill a really lippy railway builder from Toronto, that the Canada First jumped on Riel and made it so hot for him, he'd have been lynched if he'd come through Toronto to negotiate. He couldn't. And when he was an MP, he had to have police protection. Canada First insisted that Canada must be Protestant and British. Period. Full stop. And they were really popular right here in this city. But in the end, we prevailed. So I don't think we're going to have another Canada First movement, which strikes me as very much like the movement that Mr. Trump appeals to these days in the United States.
Hey, Professor Russell, I'm not sure if you can see me, but we studied together about 5 years ago, and I remember something you told me was that you had hoped, you had optimism that Canada would one day become a truly multinational country. That was in the thick of the Harper decade, so neither you or I were too optimistic about the immediate future, but since then, I think that we've kind of made some progress. At the same time, as you mentioned, a lot of people are disappointed in Trudeau's progress in regards to reconciliation and Indigenous Crown relations. I'm wondering about if you could comment on the Liberals' decision a couple months ago to split the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada Department into 2 departments, the Indigenous Crown Relations and Indigenous Services Departments, I believe. This to me sounds like changing the recipe, which you said is not necessarily the way forward. Whereas the Trudeau government has said that this is the first move towards dismantling the Indian Act, and they've also treated it like a catch-all. They said that it will help to solve the Indigenous water crisis and improve other services. Could you comment on whether you think that that's a good step forward or changing the recipe?
I definitely think it's a good step forward. I agree it's not one of the 94 Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls for action. But it is the recommendation of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, for which I was the chair of their research committee. We thought we had a slightly different split. We thought the part of the federal government that continues to deliver services to Native people, as long as they're not able with their own money, transfers from us, and their own resources to run their own services should be a separate department of government constantly getting smaller and smaller and smaller as Aboriginal people take over responsibility, as Manitoba Native people have, for education. On the other hand, there are these big treaty relations with the First Nations. There are people-to-people relations with the 4 big Inuit communities, and a very important relationship with the Métis Nation. And they should be, that's a full-time job, managing those. Particularly the new treaty, making new treaties on self-government and land. That itself is just huge. We have about 20 new ones, 16 that are really in place, but we have about another 45 to do. Those are and most of them are in British Columbia. That's enough for one minister to also keep her eye on the Inuit, 4 big Inuit communities in the north and the Métis Nation. So I think it's a good division of labor. I think they're both super ministers, by the way. And I think it's not a new recipe book of what has to be done. There's nothing that they'll be working on that's not in the 94 calls, but they are, they have 2 ministers to do it.
Okay, take 2 more questions. We'll take them from the middle because I don't want the middle to feel it's been neglected. So we have one down here, right in the second row.
That's Richie. Thank you, Richie. I didn't. I sure remember you.
Don't feel left out if he doesn't remember you.
Thank you, Professor Russell. Earlier in answering a question, you called for a strong judiciary system in Canada.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if, in your mind, that included a strong presence for parallel legal systems like the human rights tribunals and the like.
Oh, yes, the human rights tribunals have an enormous importance. I see them as part of our embracing universal human rights, and they're sort of proactive agencies that don't wait for cases necessarily to come to them. They're out there trying to remedy problems in the community, both in government and in the private sector. Very important, because remember, our Charter of Rights doesn't have much application to the private sector. So human rights commissions are tremendously important. I don't see them as one of our additional civic culture things. I think they're embraced by universal human rights. I mean, that's the biggie.
One final question. I believe there was one. Yes, just there. Make it good. You're the last one.
Well, I'm going to diverge a little bit from Canada, and I'd like to ask you, in terms especially of your holding up Canada's government as a model for the world and a model for our managing to get along together within a country as we have. What do you think now about the separatist and nationalist movements we're seeing, especially in Europe? I'm thinking of Britain with Scotland wanting to separate, with the latest in Catalonia in Spain. And do you see a movement in either of those countries in our wonderful direction?
Yes, I do in the UK. I think they embraced what Canada led the world in. We were the first constitutional democracy in the world to trust the democratic process in handling a separatist movement. That was just huge in the 1970s. It was just huge. I was the director of research for the RCMP, and we found that the government of Canada had been treating Mr. Lévesque's party just like the FLQ, no difference between them and terrorists. And all that changed. And it changed not only because Mr. Trudeau thought it should change, but the leader of the Conservatives, so did Joe Clark, that we should allow the democratic process to be how separatists make their case. They should be free to make it. And as long as they don't use violence, but use democratic means, we've just got to put our trust in that. We were the first country in the world to do that. The UK was brave enough to do it. They did. Spain doesn't seem to be up to it. But I think our example will be very telling in the weeks ahead in Spain. I think ours is the right way to go. Mr. Chrétien used a very blunt line. It was his manner after the Quebec referendum, and boy, wasn't that close. He said, we don't want to keep Quebec in Canada by force. We don't want to use force to keep them in. That's not us. And in his blunt, simple way, I think he spoke for us and spoke to the world. Does that answer your question? That's something I think we should be proud of.
Okay, I've but 2 tasks left to me. The first is to introduce a student from the college who will thank Peter Russell for what he's given us tonight, and that student is James Chapman. He's a third-year student in urban studies here at the college and also in political science. And lest you think that that was the only reason, I'm going to do what Peter does. I'm going to brandish something of ours that I hope you will check out if you have the opportunity, and you'll see this lovely picture of Peter with a profile interview, and it's by none other than James Chapman. So, James will now come to thank Peter.
I guess sitting in the audience, I realize that I'm certainly no one to speak with any authority on the issues that Peter's been discussing tonight. I don't have any scholarly works published, I have to admit, while of course Peter has quite a long list. I will say before I thank Peter that I came across Peter's writing in Paul 2:14, which is a course that every political science student at U of T will likely encounter. And Peter's reader, it's called the Russell Reader. It's, I think Peter will admit, is not the most exciting book. I don't think there's a picture in the whole thing. But every student in Canadian politics reads Peter's work to this day. I think we can see the relevance of Peter's work as we talk about, as one of the audience members mentioned, these nationalist, populist movements across the world, and in the issues that come up when we discuss things like Canada's 150th. It was a pleasure for me to get to do an interview with Peter. If you haven't had a chance to pick up the magazine, I would encourage you to do so. Peter has a wealth of knowledge and interesting stories. I think we were supposed to meet for about 2 hours that day. We ended up getting moved from room to room because we talked for more like 4 to 5, I believe. Anyhow, so on behalf of the college, I'd like to thank you all for being here, and of course Peter for continuing to involve us in his work and in the events that he is hosting. So thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. About the prize. Yeah. About the prize.
Oh, I will. Ever the promoter, Peter says, don't forget to mention the prize. So that's the last thing I'm going to do. I'm going to do it a little more subtly than he just... Peter, please. First you say, we welcome you to join us for a reception in the lobby. See, this is how you warm them up. You're supposed to be opening that while I'm doing this. This is why I'm stretching so that people can see what you got. Boy, you can put him in front of a podium and you can talk about his book forever, but you can't get him to do a simple task like open a box. Anyway, so I think it's in there. It's little. No, it's in that.
In here?
Yeah, I know. He's like, this is it?
Paper,
Just
son.
talk for an hour and I get a piece of paper?
Oh my goodness sakes. Oh, that is beautiful.
You have to take those glasses out of your...
Mm-hmm. Oh, my goodness.
So if everybody can, I have to do this promotion. So it's if you can, there you can see it. There you go, Canada 150 pocket square.
Thank you very much. College.
So, as I say, we welcome you to join us in the lobby for a reception. It would be remiss if I did not mention that Peter has set up a prize in his name for students at the college. Should you wish to donate to it, I think Peter would be pleased. So you will find donation slips. Also, don't forget, if you have not gotten a copy yet of this book, you'll want to get one, and you'll want to get the author to sign it. And I'll also just mention, since I should do a little plugging for the college, that our next 2 events, October 26th, we are showing the finale of Alias Grace prior to its broadcast. And we will have, at the very least, Sarah Pauly in attendance.
Oh.
Yeah. And then on November 7th, we will have our Harold Innes lecture, and this year's speaker will be Andrew Coyne. So, please join us now in the lobby for more of Peter Russell and drink and food. Okay, thank you very much for coming, and thank you again to Peter.